All right, Amir, if you want to go ahead.
All right. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Cooperative Monitoring Center at Sandia National Laboratories, I want to welcome you to our virtual CMC seminar speakers event, addressing the role of scientific collaboration to advance global security. My name is Amir Mohagigi, and I'm the Managing Director for the CMC. We are very excited to hear from today's speaker, but first, a few ground rules to make sure everything goes smoothly. First, this is an unclassified event. Please keep all questions and comments unclassified. Second, please mute your mics during this presentation to avoid any kind of accidental interruptions. Third, if you have a question for the speaker, email it to cmc@sandia.gov. That's CMC for Cooperative Monitoring Center at sandia.gov. Please do not type questions in the chat box. Our moderator, Dr. Bradley Dickerson, will try to ask as many questions as possible during the Q&A section after the presentation. Lastly, and we've had these challenges all the time, if this meeting fails or you cannot hear the speaker, please exit the meeting and re-log back in. That seems to solve most of the problems. Our apologies in advance if there are any technology challenges. And now, to introduce our speaker and moderate today's event, please welcome Dr. Bradley Dickerson. Bradley, screen is yours.
Thank you, Amir. For those of you who don't know, my name is, like Amir said, Bradley Dickerson. I lead Sandia's Global Chemical and Biological Security Group, and today I will be your moderator. The Cooperative Monitoring Center, or the CMC at Sandia National Laboratories, was created to demonstrate how technological cooperation can build trust. It also provides a forum where experts can collaborate on scientific solutions to international security problems. For more than 25 years, the CMC has hosted and worked with experts from around the world to promote peace and security through science diplomacy. The CMC welcomes scientists and experts that are thinking across boundaries and beyond traditional problems, and works to apply cutting-edge science, engineering, and technology to strengthen international security. Yeah, I think that it's, as Amir, maybe some of you just heard, Amir said that this is the kickoff of our short series of chem and bio issues for the CMC, and this has been the first time that we've been able to do this since I've been here. So we're really excited about that here at Sandia, and I think that it's really good that Dr. Epstein is our first speaker in this series. Let me introduce him now. He's Jerry is a good friend of mine and basically a world leader in chem bio, and particularly around chem bio policy. He's a distinguished research fellow at National Defense University's Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. At NDU, he addresses challenges posed by nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, but more specifically focused on security implications of advanced life sciences, biotechnology, and other emerging and converging technologies. He previously served 2 stints within the Executive Office of the President. Most recently, he was the Assistant Director for Biosecurity and Emerging Technologies at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. But he also previously had a dual appointment, and I actually only know of 2 people who've ever had these type of dual appointments, where he was the Assistant Director within the Office of Science and Technology Policy for National Security, and also served as a Senior Director for Science and Technology on the National Security Council staff. He also served, and this is where I got to know him best, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for CBRN Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Jerry has held numerous positions in public service, academia, and industry, and is also a widely published author. After the talk, I will moderate some brief questions and brief question and answer session with our speaker. So, Jerry, thank you for joining us. Let me turn it over to you now.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that, Bradley. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to speak with you today. Let's see if I can figure out a way to get my screen share, and hope this is the right version of what I'm doing. Let's see. Are you seeing charts at this point?
Yes, we see your whole. It's not in presentation mode, but we see it.
Actually, I don't see it. I mean, I don't see it in this window. So Well, let me do this. Is it presentation mode now?
No.
No. All right, let me try a different.
Now.
We got it now. Okay, great. Sorry for the technical glitches. Happy to talk with you all about biodefense and the return to great power competition. I wanted to start off providing a little bit of context, which is to recognize that the focus of U.S. biodefense efforts has really changed over time. Prior to the mid-1990s, bioweapons were primarily seen as a state threat. Bioterrorism was a continual concern in the community, but it never really got much traction in terms of a percentage of national resources devoted to it. To the extent to which the United States invested money in biodefense, it was primarily in terms of force protection for the military should they run into biological agents on the battlefield. And even in that capacity, even for states, biological weapons really were not seen to provide much of a very useful capability. In fact, I think this is why countries were able to agree to the 1975 Biological Weapons Convention. They realized they're hard to control, the effects are unpredictable, it's hard to model, hard to rely on them, hard to be very targeted about it. And so states found themselves being able to say, we're better off with all states getting rid of this, and therefore, and that's largely because they weren't seen to have a great deal of tactical utility. However, we found out after the Biological Weapons Convention was ratified, the Soviet Union almost immediately began a massive and treaty-violating program of biological weapons development, employing tens of thousands of people, lots of institutes. We also learned that Iraq, prior to the first Gulf War, had also been developing biological weapons. So even though there were questions about whether they were actually useful, these states in particular seemed to find that they were. And so again, it reinforced the notion that it was primarily a state problem. Somewhere around the middle of the 1990s, the focus of U.S. attention began to shift towards bioterrorism. And there's a couple of things that led to that. I'll just tick off a few. 1995, white supremacist Larry Wayne Harris had been able to obtain cultures of Yersinia pestis, the pathogen responsible for bubonic plague, which was quite concerning, that there was actually no legal barrier for people that may have had an intention that he may have had to use that agent for a terrorist weapon, and that led the United States to create sets of legislation and regulation putting controls on these agents, first on their transfer and later on their possession. President Clinton read a novel, The Cobra Event, in April of 1998. This is a book about a terrorist group developing a chimeric viral pathogen that combined characteristics of the common cold with smallpox. So it was highly lethal and also highly transmissible. The president read the book and asked his advisors, was this a realistic scenario? And there was a meeting convened of life scientists and biodefense experts in response to that question. It was not just looking at the feasibility of that particular scenario, but whether or not some aspects of reviewing U.S. biodefense posture was also discussed. And a month later, the president issued Presidential Policy Directive 62, Protection Against Unconventional Threats to the Homeland and American Overseas. This is one of the earlier presidential directives that actually focused on not just state use, which was covered, but non-state use of weapons of mass destruction, and the biological threat got a few lines in that directive. The 9/11 attacks, and then particularly the October 2001 anthrax attacks, certainly reinforced this focus on bioterrorism. Billions of dollars were added to Homeland biodefense budgets, again, because on the one hand, the 9/11 attacks showed that terrorists could indeed, seek to kill thousands and thousands of people. That was always a question in the community of people thinking about chemical and biological terrorism is there really an advantage to a terrorist group of having that scale of devastation? I think 9/11 showed that there was. They killed 3,000 people, but their aspirations were to kill, I think, 100,000 people. The October anthrax attacks were sort of the flip side. There were not that many people sickened or killed by those attacks, but the attacks showed that it could have been much more devastating if that envelope hadn't been opened up in an office, but had been scattered in a highly populated area. And it showed that biological pathogens had indeed been used for a terrorist-style attack. So the combination of those events really focused on the bioterrorism threat to the country. Much of the investment that the nation the nation put into biodefense at that point would have been relevant to either a state attack or a bioterrorist attack. But I think bioterrorism was clearly the greater motivation at the time these policies and investments went into force. Now, if you pardon the fractured physics analogy, we have a two-dimensional pendulum. It doesn't just swing between bioterrorism and state-level threats on the deliberate side, but there's also a dimension to the extent to which the country worries about a deliberate attack of any sort versus a natural outbreak. And this pendulum took a right-angle turn and started swinging towards natural outbreaks in the mid-2000s, with outbreaks of H5N1 avian influenza, a highly pathogenic to birds virus that was responsible for killing millions of chickens and poultry around the world, it was quite lethal to those very few humans who were infected by it. And fortunately, that disease was not transmissible person to person. But it was a form of influenza, and the concern was, should that highly deadly disease mutate to a form that became highly transmissible, we would have a devastating global pandemic. In 2009, the pandemic arrived. This is the H1N1 influenza. It was highly transmissible, fortunately not very lethal. So again, it didn't have both of those attributes that made it devastating, but it did show there was a global pandemic as a real possibility, and the next one could have been even worse. So the U.S. government spent quite a bit of time and attention looking at pandemic planning, and Bradley Dickerson was quite involved in DHF efforts to pursuing that. And as I've talked about the focus of U.S. biodefense efforts changing over time, the focus of U.S. national security policy has also changed as different threats have had greater or less salience over the years. The end of the Cold War, marked by the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, appeared to moderate the great power threat to the United States. During those decades of the Cold War, we had an existential ideological confrontation with an implacable enemy, or at least parts of the Cold War that appeared that way. And that was the great power threat facing the country. When the Cold War went away, we thought that, okay, the great power threat is gone. And then 9/11, as I mentioned earlier, swung us to focusing on the global war on terrorism, not just in terms of effect on biodefense, but in terms of national security strategy more broadly. Terrorism was seen to be a much greater threat than nation states. We found ourselves in conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, but even those conflicts within or against states, they persisted for decades, and they were characterized by insurgency and terrorist tactics. And the primary reason for remaining involved in both of those countries was to deny a sanctuary where a terrorist group with global ambitions, Al-Qaeda in the case of Afghanistan or ISIS in the case of Iraq, would have a sanctuary in which to regroup and pose a global threat. So even those conflicts within states were really motivated by concerns about terrorism. However, at this unipolar moment, the period where the United States was the only superpower and we really didn't face much of a challenge, faded not too soon, not too late afterwards. We find out that Russia invaded its neighbor Georgia in 2008. Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and created an armed separatist movement in the eastern borders of Ukraine. And Russia is also engaging in a military buildup and has developed several new types of nuclear weapons. And these nuclear weapons are not aimed at Russia's near neighbors. These nuclear weapons are aimed at us. Looking at China, China had observed the U.S. military operations during the Gulf War, and closer to China, what it considered its own interests. There was a Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996. There have actually been a number of Taiwan Straits crises, but the 1996 one involved China launching barrages of ballistic missiles targeting the island and making clear to the Taiwanese that they had a big and not necessarily friendly neighbor next door. The United States at the time made it a point of showing that we would be able to reinforce Taiwan in a conflict against China, including sailing an aircraft carrier battle group in between Taiwan and the mainland. And China realized at that point that it would not have been capable of preventing the U.S. from resupplying Taiwan. And at that point, it redesigned and rebuilt its entire military with the precise objective of thwarting the U.S. ability to project power overseas. Moreover, China is asserting that the South China Sea, which the rest of the world considers to be international waters, is its domestic territory, even though there's an international tribunal ruling to the contrary. China, as part of its military buildup, wants to be able to assert its sovereignty over this part of the world. So whether or not the United States considered itself in a great power competition, both Russia and China made it clear that they were not willing to live in a world where the U.S. was the undisputed sole superpower. So the U.S. national security strategy in 2017 recognized this fact. There's a line in there after being dismissed as a phenomenon of an earlier century. And I'll admit that during this period, I was one of the people that dismissed great power competition. I sort of associated it with Britain and German naval contestations around the world and pre-World War I dynamics within Europe. I really didn't see that the world was going to go great power competition. But the national security strategy said great power competition has returned. And this was a Trump administration document, but I don't think this was a particularly partisan point. I think a Democratic document might have been worded somewhat differently, but I do believe the Biden administration shares this view of the world. The United States does face great power competitors and needs to consider a world in which we have great power competition, which could at some point lead to great power conflict. So the question I'd ask myself is, what are the implications of this for biodefense? If great power wars were unlikely, great power biological warfare would be even more unlikely. But how about the inverse? If great power war is now something we have to take much more seriously, what does that mean in terms of the objectives that great powers might seek to apply biological weapons to? Well, I think the military value of biological weapons in combat is still quite uncertain. I don't think much has happened to change that. Although there are some scenarios where even in a more classic great power war, that a biological weapon might have some military utility. The United States military strategy depends on being able to resupply its forward-based forces with logistics and with personnel if the conflict extends for some period of time. And there might be ways in which biological weapons could contaminate ports or disable them or prevent the ships or the aircraft from flying, which could make quite a dent in the U.S. war plan. So that might be a factor that a great power might seek to support a biological weapon as part of a more conventional military program. But I think great powers might also have other uses for biological weapons, and maybe these are more interesting. How might these other things that great powers might find some value in change the way we think about that weapon? And how might such great power attributes differ from what terrorist threats we've been worried about? In some cases, as I'll get into, they don't necessarily, but in other cases, I think it provides a new look. For one, the scope and the scale of the resources a great power can apply to a biological weapons program vastly exceed whatever a non-state group could bring to bear. Now, this doesn't translate to an equivalent disparity in the amount of damage a great power can do versus that terrorist group, because biological weapons have the attributes, or they could have the attributes of one, being contagious, and two, being self-propagating. So even a small group, should it be able to unleash or create a pandemic strain, could have catastrophic or globally catastrophic consequences with resources far less than a great power might have. Almost any other weapon system, whether it be conventional or nuclear or even chemical, the magnitude of the devastation is somewhere proportional to the investment that the attacker is putting into it. But biological weapons, since they have this self-propagating property, don't really share that. So the difference in scale of resources isn't really relevant if one's talking about a pandemic threat. But as I'll get into later, states may not be particularly interested in that. And for anything else that a state or an attacker might wish to do, then to the extent that resources matter, a great power has far more resources than a non-state group would have. Another thing where a great power has a significant advantage over a non-state group is the technological sophistication it could bring to a program. A state program with advanced R&D capabilities could choose to develop sophisticated biological weapons that actually push the state of the art of what's known in the scientific community, should it so choose. Now, clearly, terrorists should be assumed to be capable of exploiting whatever is available in terms of science and technology. But I don't think terrorists are going to invest in an R&D program that's going to learn new science and new facts explicitly for the purpose of developing a weapons agent, whereas a state-level group might be able to do that. So if one's looking at the sophistication of the attack, a state could push that envelope in directions that a terrorist group, I think, would not be able to do. Assassination is something that great powers, particularly Russia, has shown a proclivity to, and I think there could be considerable utility in biological agents. Russia's already used chemical agents, including novel chemical agents, for that purpose, and they may well find biological agents could serve that goal as well. Its willingness to violate the Chemical Weapons Treaty and international norms against chemical weapons use may indicate a similarly tenuous commitment to the Biological Weapons Convention. So not clear that this treaty would block Russian use of a biological weapon for an assassination if it found that to be in its interest. Now, terrorists clearly are also interested in assassinations. But to the extent that a novel weapon might need to be developed with particular attributes for that purpose, I think the state program or a Russian program would have an advantage over what terrorist groups could bring to bear. And one can imagine effects other than killing the victim. An advanced biological weapon, one could conceivably include effects such as disrupting cognition, influencing mood, changing mental states. And this might be able to be done in a way that simulates natural degradation. So it might not even be clear that there had been an attack at all. These are attributes that conceivably could be put into an advanced biological weapon that I think would be beyond what almost any terrorist group would be able to accomplish. I think biological weapons might also have a role in ambiguous operations, which is an area where, again, Russia has shown itself to be quite interested in, so-called gray zone activities. The little green men that invaded Ukraine with no insignia that later proved to be Russian troops, but at least was deniable at the beginning where it wasn't clear where they were from. Biological weapons can be quite ambiguous. It's one of the reasons they might not have the military utility that militaries would look for, but that ambiguity might be exploitable in these types of operations. These ambiguities might include difficulty in detecting them in the first place. Has there been an attack at all? Has there been a hostile act? Difficulties in delimiting, if there has been an attack, what's the region's been affected? Where did have that attack spread to? Difficulties in differentiating whatever happened as being deliberate versus natural. And then finally, even if an attack has been detected and determined to be non-natural, figuring out what the source of that was, who was responsible for it, not only in a way that can inform United States decisions, but in a way that the United States can go to the international community and try and build a case that this country was responsible for that act. Biological weapons and the fuzziness and ambiguities involved could make all of these things difficult. Another aspect that a great power might seek to utilize for a biological weapon is conceivably what we're calling precision targeting. And this is built on the development of precision medicine, the idea that medical treatments that might be available for disease could depend on one's specific genomic makeup. Each human being may be differently amenable to different types of therapies, and therefore one knows that not that this is a drug that works for 3/4 of the population, but this is a drug that works for everybody in this category and nobody in that category. The more we're learning about genomics, the more we're learning about human physiology, the better we are able to target pharmaceutical treatments to cure diseases in ways we wouldn't have had to before. But one can turn that around. Instead of precision medicine, one can imagine precision harm. And so such weapons might be able to target people in specific ways. And one might also be able to choose the people to whom that weapon applies based on specific genetic characteristics. Might be called genetic targeting. Again, this might not be something that only states are interested in. There's plenty of terrorist groups that might have reason to kill one group of people as opposed to another. And the question facing anyone developing or trying to develop such an agent is to what extent are the shared genetic characteristics that an agent might be able to key on, this particular sequence GCAGGATC, does that sequence correlate with a factor or attribute of the target that the attacker wishes to get? If you're a terrorist group and you have a political objective and you want to kill people who are not in alignment with that, I don't think we're going to find anything in the genetic code that's going to tell what somebody's political views are. But if you're a terrorist group that wants to attack this segment of a population and protect this other segment of a population, I think it's clear that we are going to be able to find genetic markers that are going to help make that distinction. And the more we learn about the genome, the better we'll be able to make that. That won't necessarily be a very clear-cut choice. We find humans are fairly genetically homogeneous in lots of ways. So a group going down this road is going to have to decide, well, here's the genetic characteristic I'm targeting, and most of the people look like this, but a couple of them don't. That's all things that the attacker would have to figure out. But advanced biological weapons might make those choices available. Either terrorist groups or states may be interested in that, but I think a state with an advanced R&D program would be better able to exploit it. Another aspect that biological weapons may be relevant is something that Greg Koblenz, who has studied this topic at George Mason University, calls regime security. And he points out that authoritarian regimes over time have used both chemical and biological weapons for assassinations and for counterinsurgency operations when they are faced by security threats, largely internal threats, and these are the weapons they are applying against those groups thought to be the basis of the terrorist groups that are threatening the regime. And he extrapolates that an authoritarian, technologically advanced regime such as China certainly checks both of those boxes. It might wish to develop advanced biological weapons for the purpose of repressing, pacifying, or controlling the behavior of some element of its population, or even for reducing their fertility. A regime today might not want to go through all the messiness of genocide, which involves killing hundreds of thousands or millions of people, but if one wanted to eliminate a certain population within the country, eliminating the fertility of that group could accomplish that same goal over time, but without all the dead bodies. So what might the U.S. do in response to some of these things that great powers could be interested in using biological weapons for? Well, I think that most of the things I've mentioned here, in most of the areas I've discussed, the target of a great power biological attack would be a country surrounding either Russia or China. We've seen both Russia and China have had a great deal of military interest in things going on in the region, and they may be the targets of an attack. We may find Russia or China targeting specific individuals if they're seen as threatening the regime, and we might find them targeting minority or dissident populations. The characteristics of all of these target categories is that they're much closer to Russia and China than they are to us. So we might not be very well positioned to prevent such attacks, or even indeed to help the people of the groups that have been targeted to defend themselves or to respond to the attack. I think where the United States could be most interested, should these types of attacks come to pass, is denying the ambiguity that those states might be relying on. They want to accomplish some end, but they don't necessarily want to be fingered as the responsible party. And the things that are needed to deny ambiguity are the same things we've recognized are needed for biodefense in general, in an era where we recognize attackers are not going to limit themselves to any top 5 or top 10 or top 20 list of pathogens in terms of the things they might want to use. We've recognized that agent-agnostic biodetection is important for biodefense. We don't know quite what the agent's going to be that the next attack will be using, particularly if that attacker is trying to exploit the ambiguity in biological weapons and using an agent that's not going to be readily identified as a threat at all. And as I mentioned earlier, if an attack does happen and we are able to figure out what has gone on, it'll be very important to develop those attribution techniques by which we can inform our own decisions, and we can go to the world community and say, this thing that was not very clear as it was going on, we have determined was a biological attack, here's the agent was used, and here's the power that did it. So both of these areas, which again, aren't new things, they're both things that we thought would be relevant in a future biological conflict of any type, I think might be particularly important if we're facing a great power taking advantage of some of these areas to go down in terms of a biological attack. So the last thing I want to talk about is COVID-19. How does the fact that we've just spent a year under a pandemic change the types of things I've been talking about? How might this talk have been different if I'd given it a year or a year and a half ago? Well, COVID-19 has certainly demonstrated devastating global consequences. But those were consequences of a pandemic. And I think a lot of the discussion one hears about the pandemic having raised attention and heightened awareness of a biological attack is a little bit misguided. What the pandemic has done is it has heightened awareness and heightened our knowledge to the consequences of a pandemic. For most other types of biological attacks, it's not clear we've learned a whole lot because the effects that we've noticed have been the effects of a pandemic. And I don't think states have much interest in triggering a pandemic. I think a state would be very unwise to gamble that it would be better off in a post-pandemic world than it found itself in a pre-pandemic world, partly because of the ambiguities we've been talking about exactly how a biological outbreak will play out, and partly because it depends on so many things involving the response of other countries in the world and the relationships they have with each other. There's so many things we've learned about how the globe responds to a pandemic that I think would be difficult for a state to have a high level of confidence at predicting in advance. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I can say the same thing about non-state groups. I can imagine non-state groups with particular objectives in mind that might find their objectives to be well served by doing exactly this, by creating a global pandemic. And I guess my bottom line at the conclusion of this talk is even though we are in an era of great power competition, and I think I've made clear why we find ourselves in the circumstances, that it's very important that we not forget about the other guys. Let's not forget about terrorists, particularly since a terrorist might have more inclination to pursue a pandemic than a non-state, than a state might. So the focus on great power competition, while it does need to inform a lot of what we do in terms of our defense and strategic planning, it shouldn't be so single-minded that we're taking our eye off the ball of other potential threat vectors. So with that, why don't I go turn it over, and I'd be delighted to talk about your questions. And let me see if I can get in and share my screen here.
I can still see it, but I don't know if that matters too much.
Okay, I think it should go down now.
Oh, it's down.
All right. Great.
So, I'm having a bit of an echo. I'll try to talk
Oh,
through it.
let me turn off my microphone.
Oh, I got that fixed it. Thanks. So Jerry, thanks for an excellent presentation. It really was a good and insightful presentation, and brings to mind some of the challenge that we face. And I think that you and I have had these conversations about state actors and bio and chem and bio and their use of them. And I think in 2017 and before, we were of the same mind that this was something from a bygone era of being concerned about state use or state interest in them. But I think that we've probably changed our mind a bit on that in the last few years. But we'll get to some questions. I want to just remind the audience that you can still submit questions to cmc@sandia.gov. And so, but as a reminder, please don't put your questions in the chat box. Email those questions, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So, Jerry, turning back, I think that particularly for the CMC and a lot of the folks here are well-versed in non-proliferation regimes, particularly around the nuclear non-proliferation regimes. And of course, we, on the chem and bio side, we do have a CWC and a BWC with different different strengths and weaknesses. But could you talk a little bit about how do you see the state of the BW regime now as far as non-proliferation, and particularly how does it apply, or where is it weak in applying to some of these things that you mentioned, like gray zone conflicts or non-state actors, or maybe state actors using bio in kind of a non-state way?
Yeah, a great question, Bradley. Let me take a little bit of an analogy, and we ask a similar question as to the chemical regime. I think we've seen Russia use chemical agents in some of these modes, in assassination modes, and sometimes there's talk about that shows a weakening of the chemical weapons regime or a weakening of the norm. I think it does show something, but I think the fact that countries are not taking credit for this, even terrorist groups that were pursuing chemical weapons, were not bragging about it. Even ISIS, which is doing chemical attacks, was not telling the world it was doing chemical attacks. So the norm, I think, is still strong. The fact that states want to violate that and they're having to do it covertly. And so that's one complication. Looking at the biological weapons regime, I think the same thing holds true. I think any state pursuing biological weapons would, at this point, need to do it covertly. I think one of the barriers to a state doing a major military use, even though one barrier is that, again, as I said, the military utility may not be very clear, but if one is going to operate with the military using biological or chemical weapons in some way, there's got to be production, there's got to be doctrine, there's got to be exercises if it's going to be a regular routine thing. And the fact that there's a norm means you can't do that. So even if one wants to use biological weapons, the fact that it's hard to do that openly. Now, maybe we get to the point where countries just with impunity say, I don't care about that, and I don't care about it so much that I'm not even going to bother lying about it. But we're not there now. So we still have a regime that countries do feel the need to honor in terms of what they do visibly. In terms of the biological weapons convention machinery, and does the treaty need to kind of, there's a 5-year review process. There have been intersessional meetings where states have come together and talked. I think it's been a very valuable process over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. But there are some states that are bound and determined to not let that regime progress. We had a big debate about whether there should be a verification protocol in 2000 for the treaty. I am firmly convinced, and this is the United States position, that there's no effective way to monitor this treaty. It's not just a matter of we don't want to give up secrets or we don't want to protect our corporations. It's that biology is so ambiguous, you're either going to clear the guilty or convict the innocent, but it's not clear what a regime is going to tell you. But there are other things that states parties can come together to talk to. We don't necessarily need a verification regime, but we could beef up our ability to help countries apply the treaty. We could be more robust about how we register and keep track of various assistance that people might use with life science technology, which is part of the treaty. There's discussion on how states might agree to come to each other's aid. So there's a lot of machinery that the BWC can come to. But some states are just blocking consensus, so they're keeping that treaty from going anywhere. I think so. There are frustrations in the BWC in terms of the diplomatic machinery. In terms of its ability to capture the things I've talked about, most arms control treaties, particularly ones with verification regimes, have picked what they've called a militarily significant value of violation, and that's where they've tried to tune their verification efforts. And this is really looking at large-scale use of these weapons by nations in their military. If we're looking for assassinations, if we're looking for very small-scale use, it's really hard to imagine any treaty machinery. And even, again, we don't have verification machinery. I think that's for good reason. But it's hard to imagine how a treaty is going to really physically take away the ability of states to do that. I think where the treaties needs to be reinforced and is doing okay, but we need to make sure about that, it is, again, on this norm. If states are going to insist on violating a treaty, make them do it covertly, make them pay the penalty of having to keep it secret. So, very long-winded way of answering. I think we do with the biological weapons regime. I think it's still intact. I think it's still important for the world. Technology is providing areas where it's just hard for treaty machinery to get a hold of things. And we've got to do the best we can.
Sorry, I'm having trouble unmuting. This question is around, I guess, the nations that we talk about. So U.S., China, and Russia are most often the focus of discussions related to crosswalk between biological sciences and global security. Are there any other countries not mentioned today, or maybe some that were lightly mentioned, that should also be considered as high or mid-level player in the global biodefense competition? In other words, are there any countries that might be considered they're not great powers, but they may be considered pretty good powers, and therefore should also be the focal point for future engagement?
So this is on the defensive side as opposed to on the threat side, is the question?
Well, so I think it's a little bit of both. So particularly when we talk about U.S., China, and Russia, it's on the defensive side. But when we're doing our global engagement, we're mainly doing it with our partners. Right. So I think maybe, actually, could you answer from both directions?
I did emphasize in the talk some areas in which I thought having an advanced R&D structure, which would be easier for a great power than certainly for a non-state group, would make a difference. I think essentially almost any country, I mean, think about biological, any country clearly has the ability to do biological weapons and that's getting more and more the case because as the bioeconomy increases worldwide, the ability to apply life sciences and biotech to useful things all over the economy, we're just going to have more and more people that are going to have more and more familiarity with more and more biological things. That's inevitable growth of technology. And that, of course, that has flipped both sides. It means that any country, not necessarily the great powers, will be able to apply what I'd call kind of the current state of practice of biotechnology for both legitimate and weapons purposes. I think only states that really have an interest in pursuing advanced biological weapons are going to develop some of these notional advanced pathogens I talked about. But there's plenty of things you can do with natural pathogens. There's plenty of things you can do with slightly tweaked pathogens. And so from a threat perspective, the level of biotechnology and life sciences available almost universally worldwide, I really wouldn't exclude any country that has an interest in devoting its resources could provide some kind of threat. And on the flip side, almost essentially any country can devote resources towards the defense. I guess here, some of the defenses are really skewed towards the high-tech side. I mean, I don't think very many countries in the world could have put out a vaccine against COVID in a year, but it's clearly not just the United States. There's something like 120, vaccine candidates being developed worldwide, and not just by the U.S., Russia, China, England, Germany, but I think India and Spain and a lot of other countries who are interested in the benefits that their bioeconomy can bring them have the ability to bring resources to develop therapeutics and vaccines on that scale. And other aspects one might need to defense. Detectors. The technology one needs for detectors is pretty ubiquitous. There are some that are more facile and quicker and cheaper than others, but being able to apply kind of, again, the common level of practice of biotechnology around the world is something that almost anybody in the world can play in. So on the threat side, we can't just look at a few particular countries unless you're looking at the most advanced types of threats. And on the defensive side, again, for things that aren't capital intensive, vaccine development costs a lot of money, but a lot of other bioscience and biotechnology is not necessarily that capital intensive. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation with partners. And another area where cooperation on biodefense is easy is even if countries don't see their security problems in the same way. One country may be more concerned about a bioterrorist attack or a biowarfare attack. Another country might not think it's a very realistic prospect for them. But every country wants to have a safe life sciences enterprise. They all care about biosafety, even if they have differences in biosecurity. In fact, I think the CMC has been really a pioneer in that, and recognizing one can have conversations with other countries about their biosafety, which can provide some biosecurity benefits, even if they don't actually sign on to the same view of the threat. So I do think that biodefense is an excellent area. We've been collaborating in that area for a long time, and I think it will remain that way for a while.
So, well, actually, it's kind of tagging on to what you said about, so one issue that we have when we're working with partner countries and trying to increase capacity there is basically what you talked about earlier, the dual use nature of bio and the democratization of it, so that no country is really off the table if you're thinking about that they could do something bad because biology has become very democratized now, or biotechnology, and so we often struggle with what's the right level or what's the right type of technologies and capacity do we build in some of these countries that are at risk and may not have the same governance structure as us. And have you thought of, or do you have any guidelines of that maybe we should use for this? It's great for us to increase vaccine capacity in a country, but maybe we shouldn't increase the ability to work with high consequence pathogens or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of approaches. I think there are certainly the need for some high containment labs in some places, but when high containment labs start becoming a venue for international competition, I've got my BSL-4 9012, that argues that we're probably building them for reasons that are more than just biodefense. And a lot of very useful defense work, if you're not actually testing live agents against, say, detectors, you don't always need high containment. And in fact, there's some room for technology development in looking at ways of replacing the need for live agents. One reason why we need live agents is on providing positive identification for detection. If one has a test for Agent X, one wants to have Agent X around to see whether the test was really working. But if one can make that same test but not having the actual agent, but just have the protein or the antigen that the test is or the DNA that the test is sensitive to, one can eliminate the need for high containment and still validate the test. So one area of science is how can you do the same things we do in biodefense but without actually having need for cultivating and having the agent. I think another area where collaboration is very useful, and it's very hard to measure this. I mean, there are a number of National Academy studies that are trying to do that. It's just the value of having the engagement. When you're working with people, you have a sense of what they're doing, you're building a relationship. It's harder for them to be keeping stuff secret on the side, although that's not foolproof. I mean, you just may be working with people who are better lying than others. But when we're going into laboratories and doing joint research and having ongoing engagements with people, you at least have a sense of what's going on in that building. Otherwise, one can imagine looking from a very high altitude at some particular structure that cars are driving up to, and we have no idea what's going on in there, but we think it's something biologic-ish, and we're getting kind of concerned about it. It's a lot better if people can go, oh, yeah, I was there 2 months ago, and I've talked to the people. Here, I'll send an email. So the ongoing engagement is a great way of reducing tensions just because we have some familiarity with what's going on. So one aspect of collaboration is the end result. What are you building with it? Another aspect of collaboration is the act of doing it, and that is a valuable end in itself. It's a little harder to measure, a little harder to justify to the bean counters, but it's a very important aspect of collaborative work.
Yeah, if you come up with some ideas on how to justify that or to measure that for the bean counters, that would be greatly appreciated. It's something that we've been working on for the last few years, and it is difficult to come up with. So actually, this is an interesting question, and actually, Jerry, I'm sorry, I find myself wanting to answer some of your questions, but I'm gonna go ahead and let you do it.
I'm gonna turn back to you after I'm done.
No, that's okay. But so the death toll population so if you're looking at COVID-19 pandemic and China versus the United States, that the per capita death toll in the United States is higher than it is in China. And so the question is there instances where a totalitarian regime may fare better in pandemics because they can more rigidly control public health, and that governance structure may be better than that. But so might a nation with a large totalitarian population come out ahead after a pandemic?
That's a long and deep conversation we can have on this, and I will want to hear your views. And I guess there's a couple of different ways of answering it. First of all, it's not clear that China's reported deaths are China's actual deaths, but I don't think they're off by orders of magnitude. So yes, China clearly did a better job than most of the rest of the world. I think one has to be careful in what lessons one's drawing on the non-totalitarian side. The U.S., frankly, had a catastrophically bad response to COVID, and we can go into all the reasons for that. But there have been democratic countries that did much, much better. South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand. Some of that is geography. New Zealand was able to sort of keep things off its shores. But other countries, other democracies were able to say, okay, they did a much, much better job than the United States. Now, there were some aspects in which, say, South Korea or Taiwan, if you look at the balance of individualism versus collectivism, they may be a little more on the collective side. So yeah, that's a factor. And then I will say there are things that a totalitarian state can do without worrying whether the population is particularly supportive or not. And they can say, we're going to lock down the city, and you 12 million people are going to sit there and wait for 30 weeks until we tell you you can come out. The U.S. government, I think, doesn't have the legal powers in some cases, and it certainly doesn't have the persuasive powers. One of the pathologies we saw about our own response is that somehow different parts of America got to decide whether we agree or we disagree with some of these public health measures, and it became politicized, and it became a mark of identity whether one actually did them or not. That's not going to be the fact in a totalitarian state. People may not have been happy about it, but they weren't going on TV and having mass protests against public health measures. So yeah, I guess there are some advantages that totalitarian states have, but I don't think it's as simple as saying they are going to be better prepared, because there's a lot of other areas in terms of, buy-in from the public. I think when the public is misguided and is getting disinformed, that buy-in is problematic. But on the other hand, buy-in from the public can actually be quite beneficial in ways that maybe a totalitarian state doesn't have. So I'd love to hear you supplement that, because again, it's a rich question, and there can be lots of areas one can go.
Well, no, I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying there. I think some government forums can be better for certain in certain events, but it also depends on the government, and they don't scale as well. In previous life, so at DHS we worked a fair amount with Israel, and people were always on counterterrorism issues and on and actually on some public health issues. Where why don't we do like Israel? They vaccinated everybody. They don't have planes falling out of the air from terrorists and all this kind of things. But they have a completely different governance system. And so they have socialized medicine, which, and I think in a small country, can work really well if you can have, particularly of some of a like mind, that it's very easy to vaccinate everybody and to require vaccinations in that kind of government. But then there are trade-offs when you have a lot of personal freedoms trade-offs, and so you may similar to what you were saying, you may not be able to weather the pandemic as well because you don't have as many people out taking initiative trying to do things for the good. I agree that, and historically, the United States has fared very well during outbreaks, public health outbreaks, and other types of natural disasters that we face. But we did not do a good job with this last one. But I don't think I don't think it's necessarily because of our governance. Our governance has many strengths, but there's also leadership components, and then having our citizens of a one mind. You mentioned the other democracies that fared really, really well, but I think that they were able to have more of their countries kind of the same mind than we were. So I think that it's just that our open government has a lot of challenges in it, and so that makes it we have to work harder on certain areas that maybe we took for granted before, that we kind of thought that everybody was more of a like mind, and so that I think that we as practitioners in chemical and biological defense maybe need to do a better job of communicating with our public, and yeah. So anyway, it's a very interesting question.
Let's pick up on one thing you said before I get to the next question. You mentioned about Israel having socialized medicine. I think that actually may have been a much bigger factor than democratic versus authoritarian, in that the United States has such a fragmented health system. National defense and terrorism are federal responsibilities, but by and large, your health is your business, or your insurance company's business, or maybe your state's business. But it is the public health or the health of the population is not really a federal responsibility. We have this fragmented system where states and cities and public health districts makes it very, very, very difficult to take a coherent view towards responding to a nationwide outbreak, whereas Britain, which, by the way, didn't do that great either, but the National Health Service gives us some real advantages in responding to either a natural or a biological attack. And the magic of having that sort of national health system is it doesn't matter in England whether it's a natural attack or a natural outbreak or a deliberate attack, because the same machinery comes into play. Clearly, there's law enforcement and intelligence and attribution stuff. In the United States, it makes a massive difference if it's an attack versus a natural outbreak, because by and large, a natural disease outbreak is of no concern to the federal government. The federal government doesn't care if I get a cold on the metro. When it gets to a pandemic, it becomes a federal issue, but we kind of don't know how to navigate that transition, and we don't know how to promulgate consistent guidance in a way that the whole country actually agrees and does it. We have each governor going, well, I'll go with that, no, I won't go with that. So I think the lack of a national health system, for whatever other issues you want to get into in terms of the healthcare debate, the lack of a national healthcare system in the United States was a real handicap, I think, in responding to this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, and actually, I should also say that these this is not necessarily these are my thoughts and Jerry's thoughts, and we do not represent Sandia or the CMC. Just
there was my tiny little disclaimer on my title slide. I hope everybody read and took to heart. But yes, thank you for pointing that out.
So I think there's one more question. Let's see. Around, I guess, state use. Actually, there's two questions. One around state use of a bioweapon. Would they want to use it, particularly? And I think that the discrepancy here, the difference here is if an infectious agent versus a non-infectious agent. Would a state want to use an infectious agent if it may blow back on them? And then the other thing is, COVID-19 was well, we don't know exactly the origins, but probably a naturally occurring outbreak. What would be the differences? How would we know if it wasn't a naturally occurring outbreak?
Great. Let me take both of those. I think on what's the utility of a biological weapon to a country if it's, I think rather than infectious, non-infectious, contagious versus non-contagious is the real dimension. And I think that's actually a really good point. I think contagious agents, I mean, to the extent that any biological agent is maybe difficult to control and hard to be very precise about using it, contagious agents are so much the more so. I mean, they just go where they go. The subsequent propagation after you've distributed it is totally determined by interactions among people. And so that's another reason why it becomes even less useful from any sort of predictive sense. And I think if one starts to imagine, would a country worry about a contagious agent coming around and affecting them? Yes, it might. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I don't think a state has much interest in creating a pandemic. And I think the United States, I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I don't think we particularly, we pursued infectious agents, but I don't know that we did much on contagious ones, precisely for that reason. I think, and I was actually, I mean, among the many things there were to be stunned about with the revelations of the Soviet program. I mean, I never in my life thought I would ever hear a sentence that had the word ton and the word smallpox in the same sentence. It's just inconceivable. But one of the things that was hard to imagine is what could the Soviet Union possibly have thought it could accomplish by spreading smallpox as a biological weapon, precisely for that reason. It's going to envelop the world. Until I realized, I think their concept of operation was to use smallpox after nuclear war to kill the survivors. And there wasn't going to be a whole lot of international commerce at that point, so maybe a contagious agent made sense. But it is really hard to think how a state might find some value in using a highly contagious agent. Where something like anthrax, which is infectious, and you can spread it and send it in the air, it's not going to get spread person to person. Or even, there are also agents that normally spread, they say, through water. They're waterborne, but you can also aerosolize them and get a lot of people to breathe them. But even though it may be contagious, it's not contagious by re-aerosolization. So that's also more containable. So yeah, those are very much among the things that any state or any actor pursuing a biological weapon would have to think about. What was your second question again?
So with COVID-19, how would we know,
yeah.
if there was a pandemic, how would we know that it was caused by a malevolent?
I mean, this origin discussion, I think, is quite active, and I think deserves to be. I think whether or not the outbreak was caused by a natural spillover, as many think, or whether it was due to a release from a laboratory, I don't think we know. And I don't think we have a lot of evidence either way. And I think we may never know whether it was a lab release. And if one looks at some of the things, people who have been dissatisfied with the WHO finding and said, well, it wasn't a serious investigation of a lab release. They needed to have done this, and this, and here's this 200-page document of the protocols one would have needed to have done to convince oneself it wasn't a lab release. The Chinese were clearly not interested in doing that. I think that no country in the world would do that. I think some countries in the world would have gone to a much greater effort to be transparent about their own investigations, and they wouldn't have been quite so misleading about other aspects of it. But the idea that even under UNSCOM, even marching into a defeated country like Iraq with unlimited powers, it's very hard to get to some of these questions. And the question about whether it was a lab leak, if it was, and there may be information that would show that if that could ever come out. If they're shown that there's a strain the lab is working with and it's shown to be matching COVID, that would be pretty conclusive. I don't think we'll get there. On the other hand, I do think it is possible to get reasonably confident in a natural outbreak, but we're not there yet. If we found the closest virus we found to COVID-19 in the natural world is a bat virus, which is something like 96.5% of the genome of COVID-19. That's quite a bit, a whole lot of mutations away from COVID. So it's not inconceivable. It may be likely that something like that is a distant progenitor of COVID. But if we actually found an animal with a virus that was a very small number of mutations away from COVID, I think that's pretty conclusive. We have not found that animal, and they've been looking a lot for it. But so I think it's conceivable that we will find confirmation of a natural outbreak if it's a natural outbreak. If it turned out to be a lab release, I don't know how we'll ever be able to confirm that, other than an effector or something like that later telling us about it. But it's not quite that we'll never have a clue. I think if it was natural, there are other cousins. There are cousins and brothers and sisters of COVID-19 out there, which A, will help us in determining whether it's natural or not, but B, they might bite us next. And so, but the last complication, just to go around, is people come to different views as to how important it is to find those close cousins. Because if it was a lab release, the reason why it was a lab release is because somebody was working on it in a lab. And there have been some, it's not just allegations, I think it's known that there were some manipulations that the laboratories in China were doing to these viruses to see whether they might be more human transmissible. They're trying to make them such that they would bind more tightly to a human receptor. And so that's why a lot of people are going, well, that's a pretty amazing coincidence. And if that indeed was the reason why COVID was sprung, then maybe we don't want to go run around the world and sample a whole bunch of close cousins and do a lot of work with them, because maybe we want to know what's out there, but that might give us some reason to pause about the types of manipulations we should be doing with agents like that in the name of trying to protect ourselves. We certainly don't want the protection to be causing the problem we were hoping to protect ourselves from.
Absolutely. Well, Jerry, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us today. It's very enlightening and always good to talk to you. I'll always learn something when I'm talking to you, I think. So, and for our audience, thank you all for joining us today. Remember, you can find out more about the CMC and its ongoing work by visiting CMC at sandia.gov. And we hope to see you at future Cooperative Monitoring Center events. So thank you all.